Critical Thinking Rule 11. Reckon with counterexamples. This rule is about dealing with counterexamples to generalizations made by an argument. Universal propositions of the form all x are y can be disproved with one counterexample. That's all you need because the generalization is supposed to apply to the whole population, all members of the group. Example, all fast foods are unhealthy. If you could identify one type of fast food that's not unhealthy, then that would disprove the universal proposition. Other generalizations require more than one counterexample, and the number is going to depend on the specific generalization. For example, 90% of fast food meals contain double the daily recommended saturated fat intake. Notice that this is a statement of proportion. 90% of the fast food meals contain this property. Also notice that stating that the fast food meals contain double the daily recommended saturated fat intake is much more precise than just saying that they're unhealthy. So it's easier to test. In order to test this claim and see if there's any counterexamples, you would need to take a sample of the population of fast food meals and then measure them to see if they actually had this property of containing double or more the daily recommended saturated fat intake. So oftentimes, in order to test a generalization using counterexamples, you have to create a new generalization based on that population, maybe based on a new sample. How to deal with counterexamples. If you yourself are arguing for a generalization, it can be good to bring up possible counterexamples to the generalization to deal with them in order to disarm potential criticisms of your argument. Also, if you're evaluating an argument for a generalization, then you want to see if it does bring up and deal with or disarm counterexamples to that generalization. There's two main strategies. One is to argue that apparent counterexamples are not actual counterexamples. So if someone makes the claim fast food is unhealthy or argues for that generalization, someone else might have as an objection, well, Subway is a type of healthy fast food. In this case, Subway is not actually that healthy if you look at most of the food served there. So you could, for example, present data on the average calories per sandwich or amount of saturated fat or the amount of refined flour, other things like that, to show that the apparent counterexample is not an actual counterexample. A second way of dealing with counterexamples is to argue that they do exist, they're real, but they're outliers. So in other words, they don't conflict with the generalization. This is tricky because if you are making a generalization that is a universal proposition of the form all x are y, then all it takes is one counterexample to disprove the generalization. Dismissing counterexamples as outliers or not conflicting with the generalization as a whole only works if the generalization is a probability or a statement of proportion. So, example, the generalization fast food is unhealthy. There are healthy fast food restaurants such as Sweet Green. You can see one of their meals in the bowl on the right. I've never eaten there, but supposedly they're healthier than average fast food. Okay, someone could say, well, okay, Sweet Green is healthy, but it doesn't disprove the generalization. A better response still is to clarify what the generalization is actually claiming. Saying fast food is unhealthy is ambiguous between the claim that all fast food is unhealthy and the claim that most fast food is unhealthy. There's also vagueness in what unhealthy means, so that's also something you would want to make more precise. So one nice thing about counterexamples is that they can force people who are making and arguing for a generalization to get more clear about what their claim actually is. And if you're going to clarify this and make it not a universal claim about fast food, then you're probably going to need to make it a statement of proportion. What percentage of fast food are you claiming is unhealthy? So it's forcing you to get more precise. And then after you've made that more precise claim, that can be tested against a sample of fast food restaurants to see if that percentage actually counts as unhealthy by some criterion. Let's look at a sample argument. In this case, we're not only going to evaluate the counterexample rule. This is going to serve as a review for all of the rules from Chapter 2, Arguments by Example. So let's look at this argument made in 2012 in an article published in USA Today. 8 members of Congress resigned during 2012. More than half of those who resigned did so because of bad or bizarre behavior, such as having extramarital affairs or tweeting nude selfies. The American public is clearly in no mood to tolerate politicians' personal failings. Unlike in past decades, we're now in an age where any politician who misbehaves will be forced from office. And the picture on the right is of Anthony Weiner, who was one of these congressmen who was forced to resign because of scandal. All right, so to begin with, by evaluating this argument for a generalization, we want to find the conclusion, which should be a generalization. Look at the last sentence. Unlike in past decades, we're now in an age where any politician who misbehaves will be forced from office. There were no conclusion indicator words, but it is the main point this argument is trying to prove, so that's why it counts as the conclusion. Once we have the conclusion, we can assess how good of a job the argument did in proving this generalization. So to begin with, we're going to look at Rule 7, use more than one example. Does this argument use more than one example? How many examples does it use? And also remember that Rule 7, even though it's phrased to suggest that it only matters if more than one example is present, it's more helpful to think of Rule 7 as asking a general question about sample size. How many examples are in the argument? How many individuals are in the sample? In general, the larger the better. So how good of a job does this argument do at following this rule? Well, we can see that the phrase more than half is all we get in terms of saying how many people are being used as examples. This is vague, so it doesn't even give us an exact number. And in order to interpret this more than half, we have to look at the previous sentence. 8 members of Congress resigned in 2012. More than half did so because of bad or bizarre behavior. So we know it's somewhere between 5 and 8. It's probably less than 8, because if all 8 resigned due to bad or bizarre behavior, it would have said all of those who resigned did so because of bad or bizarre behavior. So it's probably somewhere between 5 and 7. But yeah, that's pretty vague. It doesn't give us an exact number. So in order to assess this rule, we would say technically it does follow Rule 7. It gives more than one example, so that's the green check. On the other hand, it doesn't give a very large number, and there's also lack of clarity over exactly how many examples are being given. So at best, you would say this is a mixed following of Rule 7. And keep in mind, I'm going to score how well the argument does by each rule with a check or a cross. But in reality, there can be degrees of success with all of these rules. So don't let the dichotomy of green check and cross deceive you. It's a helpful summary of how well the argument is doing, but your analysis needs to be more refined than that. You can think of how good or how bad of a job does it do. So let's move on to Rule 8. Does this argument use representative examples? In order to determine how well the argument follows this rule, we have to remember what the argument is about. The argument's conclusion says we're now in an age where any politician who misbehaves will be forced from office. So the population that the generalization is about is all politicians. And sometimes you have to use some context to figure out what the exact population is. It's possible, since this article was published in USA Today, presumably by an American author, that it's only supposed to apply to the United States. So that's another thing that can be a bit tricky, but you have to do some interpretive work. What is the likely population that's being generalized about based on the context given by the argument? So look at the phrase members of Congress. All of the examples of politicians who resigned due to bad or bizarre behavior were from this one political body, the Congress. So that's going to be the House of Representatives and the Senate. So is that a representative example of the population? The answer is no. The generalization is all politicians, maybe all US politicians. So in order to be a representative example, ideally we'd like to have cases of resignations not just from Congress, but other types of US political bodies. Maybe judges, maybe city governments, maybe state level congressional bodies, etc. And this argument doesn't do that, so it's not representative. And one thing to consider, how could this bias the results? Sometimes examples can be clustered from one subset of a population, but they can still fairly represent the whole population because that subset does not add any bias. However, if you think about the US Congress, it's probably more visible and has more media scrutiny than other types of political bodies. So in that sense, it may not be representative of the whole population of politicians in the US. Now let's move on to Rule 9. Background rates may be crucial. So in order to assess this claim, we want to look at some background rates. Let's look at the claim again to remind us what it's actually saying. Unlike in past decades, we're now in an age where any politician who misbehaves will be forced from office. So the unlike in past decades clause is going to give us one type of background rate. We need to know how the current rate of resignation compares to that of previous decades. So look at the phrases we get in the first two sentences. First, it's talking about members of Congress who resigned during 2012 only. And then secondly, it's saying that more than half of those who resigned did so of bad or bizarre behavior. Now, both of these phrases can be clues to evaluate Rule 9 for this argument. This argument does not do a good job of following Rule 9 for two main reasons. One is that it provides us no context of previous years. We're only looking at resignations during 2012. We don't know if this is a higher or lower rate of resignation than in previous years. You also could say, maybe this is the third point, is that it's only looking at members of Congress who resigned, so we can't even compare the congressional resignations with those of other political bodies. That kind of relates to Rule 8 in terms of representative samples. And by the way, there can be overlap and interaction between different rules like this. Additionally, if we look at more than half of those who resigned, this is a crucial clue to another hidden background rate. This is giving examples of politicians who were forced to resign, but the generalization is about all politicians misbehaving in any way. What about all the politicians who misbehaved, but whose misbehavior was never made public? What percentage of the misbehavior was actually made public? What percentage of that public misbehavior forced resignations? We're not given either of those crucial, you could say, hidden background rates, and so this argument also fails for those two reasons. Rule 10, statistics need a critical eye. This is the miscellaneous or grab bag rule that just allows us to give a careful look at the numbers we're being given, the generalization being made, and seeing if it's being biased in any particular way or something's being misinterpreted or incomplete information. In this case, there are misleading things about the numbers, but we've already covered them in Rule 7 through 9, so there's not much additional to report here. However, given the fact that it's overlooking these crucial background rates and it does not use representative samples, they're only from Congress, only from 2012, and we don't know the missing bad behavior that was never detected in the first place, we have to say that it does not do a good job of following Rule 10 either. And finally, Rule 11 is about reckoning with counterexamples. When we're assessing an argument in terms of Rule 11 is not telling us to come up with our own counterexamples. It's really asking us, how well does the argument do at bringing up actual or potential counterexamples to its generalization and addressing them? So remember, this generalization is that any politician who misbehaves will be forced from office. It does not do a good job reckoning with counterexamples. This is because it doesn't bring up any cases of misbehavior that was discovered but not resulting in a forced resignation, nor does it try to estimate the amount of misbehavior that was not detected in the first place. So it's really only focusing on examples that support the generalization. It doesn't do anything to make us think there could be counterexamples, that there could not be counterexamples out there that conflict with it. So it does a bad job of following Rule 11. So what about our final evaluation? Because it fails at almost every rule, it's going to be a fail or an X. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're evaluating arguments for generalizations using Rules 7 through 11, you cannot just do a final evaluation by looking at the tally of checks or crosses, or maybe you have like your own kind of numerical scale, like maybe use a 5-point scale, a 10-point scale for how well it's following each of these rules. You can't just create a total or an average result for the final evaluation. Why? Because sometimes an argument can follow all the rules but one, but not following one rule is enough to mess it up. So, for example, look at this argument. The generalization is a comparison between we're now in an age and the past decades. Suppose this argument did a great job of following all the rules, except it provided no information about past decades. So it would only fail on Rule 9, background rates may be crucial. The fact that there's no basis for comparison would be enough to sink the argument, be enough to undermine it. You could think of arguments as like living organisms. They're complex systems that need multiple parts functioning correctly in order for it to do well. So sometimes all it takes is one mark against an argument to ruin the whole thing if it is serious enough of a problem. Next up, new chapter, arguments by analogy. These are arguments in which you claim that because two things are similar in one respect, they must be similar in another respect as well.